So what would the Shropshire landscape have looked like before humans arrived? Well, it would have looked very similar to this. I'm at the Wire Forest, which straddles the Shropshire-Worcestershire border. And part of the forest is designated what's called an ancient forest. It basically means parts of it are over 400 years old. When humans would have first arrived in Britain, much of the islands would have looked just like this. A mixture of deciduous and pine forest, covering pretty much the entire country. And Shropshire would have been no exception to this. The whole forest would have been filled with trees that were very familiar to us now. Trees like oak and silver birch, alder, ash, beech and Scots pine. You can find a lot of these trees within places like the Wye Forest, as well as throughout the rest of the whole of the country, never mind the county of Shropshire. How do we know these trees would have been within the British Isles at this time? A lot of that comes down to pollen records within bogs and lake sediments. Now, you might have noticed particularly during the summer months, a film on top of a lake or a pond. It almost looks a little oily. Now, this film is actually a layer of pollen that sits on top of the water, and eventually this pollen will settle down in a mud layer, and this will happen every year. And what we can do is we can drill down through the cores of both existing lakes and lakes that have dried up or been turned into a peat bog, and we can trace back through layer after layer after layer, looking at the pollen types that are in those layers. And what this tells us is that there was actually a succession of forestry events within British history, and over several thousand years we can trace where there are patterns between pine and silver birch growth coming out of being the first trees that established themselves after the ice retreated, the end of the last glacial maximum, and switches between that and oak and beech. And then once humans turn up, we end up with things like grasses starting to become more common as the humans are chopping down a lot of the trees. So you end up with grasses starting to become much more prevalent. We also find things like fern and moss spores in these sediments as well. Now, this ancient forest that was across the whole of the UK is often referred to as the Wildwood, and this Wildwood was what humans would have seen when they first came to the British Isles after the ice retreated. Now, the Wildwood was home to much more than just trees, and there's an abundance of wildlife within there. So next we're going to move on to see what kind of animals would have inhabited the Wildwood. Now, a lot of the animals found in the Great Wildwood would be very familiar to us now. So you'd have found squirrels in the Wildwood, but not these grey ones. They were introduced in 1876. I'm talking more about the ginger variety, a native red squirrel, which sadly has been pushed back to isolated outcrops of the UK as a result of the grey. You've also found a lot of wild birds, many of which are still common in the British Isles today. Birds that often frequent our gardens and hedgerows were actually native of the forests and the glades that made up part of the Wildwood. We've also found creatures like the ptarmigan up in the hills. Now, the ptarmigan is a grouse and is a remnant of a much colder climate. Now, currently you'll only find them in the highest peaks in Scotland, but this little fella I found in Iceland when I was away there, and I don't normally take selfies, but when you're next to one of Europe's rarest birds, I kind of indulge myself. There are also other creatures, such as the majestic red kite, which very, very nearly went extinct in the 20th century, and thankfully has made a dramatic comeback. You wouldn't have found fallow deer, but they were introduced by the Normans, but you would have found red deer across much of Shropshire, as you find them across a lot of Scotland today, up in the Highlands. Another little critter which has started to make a comeback is the adorable pine marten. Now, these have been extinct in Shropshire, but sightings have recently been made in parts of the county. And there's wild boar. Now, these things didn't really go extinct. Officially, they were gone by the 16th century, but there was always escapees from farms and enclosures that would manage to get out into the forests and cause chaos and havoc. There has been a programme to reintroduce the wild boar into parts of the British Isles in the late 20th and early 21st century, and it's had some success, along with meeting local resistance, as the wild boar do have a habit of churning up local farmland. But it's just an example of actually sometimes stuff does cling on despite human activity. Which is sadly not what we can say about the wolves. Now, these beautiful creatures were seen as having really no use by a lot of the people of Europe, and really having no part in human society. And they were hunted and persecuted and driven to extinction, certainly within Great Britain by the middle of the 1600s, and Ireland by the early 1700s. It's kind of a shame, really, because they are beautiful, beautiful creatures, and these animals would have been one of the top predators within the Wildwood of Shropshire. These are Eurasian brown bears rather than the North American variety. Now, the brown bear still exists in isolated parts of Europe, in the mountains, in Eastern Europe, and the Alps and a couple of other places. Now, in Britain, sadly, the brown bear was hunted to extinction by around about 1000 AD. So, pretty much about the time of the Norman conquest, the brown bear in the wild had gone. Also amongst the deer, you'd find reindeer. Now, we tend to think of reindeer as being these Arctic survivors, and there is some truth in that. Now, we know reindeer would have been across much of the UK. I couldn't find any information about when they were last seen in Shropshire, but there are records of the Vikings in the 12th century hunting reindeer in the very northern part of Scotland. So we know they were in the British Isles up until then. And they were reintroduced back in the 1950s into parts of the Cairngorms in Scotland. And you'd have also found the beautiful lynx, a medium-sized cat that used to hunt small mammals, but also things as big as a reindeer. When you can think that reindeer can weigh in well over 200 kilograms, and a typical lynx is somewhere around about 20 kilograms. Just talking about taking down something that's about 10 times its size. Now, the lynx is thought to have gone extinct somewhere around about 500 AD in the British Isles. you'd have also found ancient bovines within the Wildwood, in particular the auroch. Now, the last of the auroch died out in the 1600s, but you can find their descendants throughout, well, any cattle, anywhere within Europe or Asia. Pretty much all domestic cattle within Europe and Asia are descended from the auroch. And these particularly wonderful animals are on an estate in northern England called Chillingham, and they are called the Chillingham wild cattle or white cattle, and they're an isolated herd, certainly have been isolated for a few hundred years, although they're not quite sure when Chillingham white cattle first came to the area. And visually, particularly regarding the horns and along with temperaments, they are one of the closest animals that you'll find share similarities with the auroch, and quite powerful animals. You find on a lot of cave art throughout Europe pictures of the auroch as one of the beasts that they would have hunted. Now, this colossal animal is commonly referred to as the Irish elk, by its species named Megaloceros, and is a huge deer. They went extinct not just in Britain but throughout the world around about 6000 BC. And as you might notice, the most impressive thing about these creatures is that set of antlers. Now, those antlers are about 4 meters across from end to end. Largest set of antlers in the animal kingdom, and these creatures were absolutely ginormous, but were thought to have been hunted to extinction by human activity. Now, going extinct around about the same time as Megaloceros was the wolverine in Britain. And you still find the wolverine in colder parts of Europe, Russia, Canada, all up in the boreal forests up there. And these creatures, despite their size, being not much bigger than a badger, will take down reindeer. I mean, they're really, really quite powerful animals, and one of the largest members of the weasel family. Lastly, we're at the wild horses, which remains have been found across Europe, and they went extinct within Britain somewhere around about 8000 BC, leaving us with predominantly domesticated kinds of horse.